It will not be an exaggeration to say that the attack that was launched against the State of Israel on the 7th of October 2023 by Hamas impacted the entire world. The aftermath was to some extent even more worrisome though, initiating mass mobilizations of military power, as well as sparking protests and support marches for both sides of the conflict all around the world. Knowing full well the volatile nature of the region and the potential risks of escalation, everyone is watching the situation with dread, and many are asking the question, how did this happen? In this video, we're going to examine some of the theories that are currently being proposed online and look into the arguments for and against each one. To be clear, these are theories based on publicly available information, educated but nevertheless guesswork. Still, truth is something indispensable and worth trying to find in spite of all the limitations that are being placed upon us. With that in mind, let us begin. From the BBC article titled "What is Hamas and What's Happening in Israel and Gaza?" The Gaza Strip is a 41-kilometer long and 10-kilometer wide territory located between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea. Originally occupied by Egypt, Gaza was captured by Israel during the 1967 Middle Eastern War, along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel withdrew its troops and around 7,000 settlers from the area in 2005. It is home to about 2.2 million people and has one of the highest population densities in the world. Just over 75% of Gaza population, some 1.7 million people, are registered refugees, according to the UN. More than 500,000 of them live in 8 crowded camps located across the Strip. Israel controls the airspace over Gaza and its shoreline, and strictly controls the movement of people and goods through its border crossings. Similarly, Egypt controls who passes in and out through its border with Gaza. According to ABC News, the attack on the 7th of October began at 6:30 a.m. by local time, with a barrage of rockets. Most sources estimate that the number was between 2,000 and 3,000, although some reports number it as high as 5,000 rockets. The missile strike was followed up by an estimated 2,500 Hamas ground forces crossing the border separating the city of Gaza and Israel. According to Wikipedia, this border consists of a barbed wire fence behind which there is another fence and a road with sensors called Hoovers A. Behind this, there is a 150-meter wide buffer zone, code-named Hoovers B, with motion sensors in the ground and surrounded by a new sensor-equipped fence with watchtowers every 2 kilometers equipped with remote-controlled machine guns. From the video footage that we have available, we can determine that the Hamas fighters, armed with mostly Western-made weapons, breached the perimeter, some on foot, some on motorcycles, boats, Toyota trucks, and some apparently on paragliders. Having overcome the border obstacles, the Hamas forces proceeded to attack military facilities, several civilian settlements, and the site of a music festival located in the desert, taking many civilians and servicemen hostage and killing many others. The first response from the Israeli forces came 4 hours after the first attack, when the Israeli jet fighters launched a retaliatory strike against Gaza at approximately 10:30 a.m. local time. An hour later, at 11:30, the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, declared that his country was at war. The commander of the Hamas military wing, Mohammed Deif, also issued a statement regarding to their motive for launching such an operation. According to him, this came as a response to the actions of the Israeli government regarding Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy site in Islam.
Hundreds of ultranationalist Jews are carrying out incursions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex in occupied East Jerusalem. Big crowds of mostly young settlers raised provocative slogans and entered the mosque compound for a third day on Tuesday to mark a season of Jewish holidays. They are being escorted by the Israeli police. Israeli forces have set up military checkpoints in the Old City and imposed restrictions on Palestinian worshippers.
This gives us a summary of the basic setup and the events. So what are the theories regarding how this came about? There are many, but most of them can be sorted into 2 categories: intelligence failure and orchestrated event. Although there are many variations, the basic premise of all intelligence failure theories is that Hamas simply managed to overcome all Israeli surveillance and deceive all of their intelligence assets. The explanation on how Hamas managed to achieve this differ depending on the expert. However, the dominant narrative is that Israelis started relying too much on AI and did not have enough agents on the ground due to the fact that a lot of Mossad operatives are currently engaged in Ukraine.
How could Mossad, CIA, MI6, Bibi Netanyahu, Jake Sullivan / Tony Blinken / Joe Biden not have known about this? Doesn't Mossad have agents on the ground? Don't they have listening posts? Aren't they the most sophisticated and effective intelligence service in the world?
But I think it's rather a factor of Hamas's accomplished deception operation. They learned from 2 years ago that Israel depends on AI and all kinds of other collection mechanisms to find out what's going on there in Gaza. And so, what they did was operate very, very routinely so that no one would suspect what's coming down the pike. Now, it's a stretch.
The Israelis, were looking at is something we call indications and warning. Indications and warning is something we do very well. We'd like to believe so. And we look at indicators, intelligence indicators that something's about to happen. We do this in South Korea regarding North Korea that track individual events. We believe after a certain propensity of evidence that there may be something about to happen. The Israelis did a very similar thing regarding tracking the activities of Hamas and other terrorist organizations. What I believe happened, Judge, is that that Hamas and the Iranians, because I think there was nation-state support, if not sponsorship, figured out what those individual elements, what we call observables, were. They figured out what they were, and they started controlling the intelligence mechanisms feeding information into it. We did this during World War II.
How could the intelligence services sense this? Is it Mossad the most effective in the world?
Well, look, everybody periodically makes mistakes. The Mossad is very good, but the Mossad is heavily engaged in Ukraine right now, much to Russia's disappointment. They have been looking elsewhere. I don't think there was anyone who believed that this kind of well-coordinated, disciplined assault could be launched by the Arabs and Hamas. They had never manifested this ability in the past.
Some proponents of theories from this category suggest that Hamas could have done all this by themselves, relying on the financial support and assistance from large populations of sympathizers located all over the world. People who disagree with this point out that the movement of such large capital wouldn't have gone unnoticed, and that the operation which was carried out requires enormous amount of intelligence and military expertise, which Hamas has never demonstrated before. Most military experts agree that Hamas must have had significant aid from a third party. Who that third party was remains the subject of many heated debates. The list of suspects includes such countries as Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, etc. Amongst the Western analysts, the main suspect remains Iran. On the 8th of October, the Wall Street Journal published an article with the following title: Iran helped plot attack on Israel over several weeks. On that very same day, however, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken stated that the U.S. government has not yet seen evidence that Iran directed or was behind the October 7th attack. The situation remains unchanged till this day, since none of the people who accuse Iran of involvement managed to provide any substantial evidence that proves the claim. Iran itself categorically denies all accusations. In regards to Hamas, the situation is more complicated. After the attack, social media was full of all kinds of statements, allegedly made by representatives of the organization, some thanking Iran for their aid, others denying Iranian aid. None of these statements appear to have been picked up by the mainstream media, though, and therefore most likely do not hold much credence. Most proponents of the Iranian hypothesis tend to believe that Iran could have been threatened by the US efforts to normalize the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which were subsequently ruined by the Hamas attack. Their opponents, who wish to give Iran the benefit of the doubt, remind people that Hamas and Iran were not on good terms since the beginning of the war in Syria, when Iran took the side of the government and Hamas supported the rebels. This group of people also tend to be of the opinion that the diplomatic efforts by the USA were mostly symbolic and their achievements nominal at best, insisting there was no benefit for Iran to initiate such actions against the State of Israel considering the risk involved. Ultimately, as of now, even Israel made statements indicating that they have no evidence of Iranian involvement, and so the debates regarding the potential backers of Hamas keep raging on. The major criticisms of all intelligence failure narratives, however, emerge from doubts regarding the inability of the Israeli intelligence services to detect any signs of this threat. It is indisputable that the Israelis received warnings from the Egyptian intelligence and, by the looks of it, chose to ignore them. The USA were also aware of the rising tensions in the Middle East. According to an article in The Guardian by Patrick Wintour, an alarmed assessment was given by the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in June, when Richard Haass, the departing president of the Council of Foreign Relations, put it to him that based on his 40-year-plus experience, he feared that the region was not that far from boiling. Haass continued, "You're seeing now the considerable expansion of settlements, considerable expansion of violence, a real absence of a centralized Palestinian Authority, and the most right-wing government we've seen in the Israeli history." Blinken, to the surprise of Haass, entirely agreed. With the addition of the incident around the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the mix, all the experts on the region were actually expecting something akin to the October 7th attack, given the precedent of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis of 2021. That year, the Israeli police forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound using tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun grenades on the 7th of May. In response to this, by the afternoon of the 10th of May, Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum to withdraw its security forces from both the Temple Mount complex and the Sheikh Jarrah by 6 p.m. When the ultimatum expired without a response, both Hamas and the PIJ launched rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. This is what the former British ambassador Alistair Crook had to say on the matter during a program with Glenn Diesel and Alexander Mercouris on YouTube.
You know, it hasn't just happened out of the blue that Hamas have decided to, go through the fence and attack Israel. There is a background to it, and it's a background that goes back quite a long way. But what started the first Intifada? The visit to Al-Aqsa by Sharon. Even then, I remember some of Sharon's guides. He actually sent me off on a tour around the settlements with his great friend, the intelligence officer, Rafi Aitan. And at the time, the point of this was to see that the settlements would never be reversed. And he sent me around and he told them to speak to me, in clear terms, which they did. And then it was pretty clear that Sharon's visit was about raising the if you like, the profile of religious nationalism, which we see sitting in the government today, and an organization which was tiny when I first knew it, the Temple Mount movement, about rebuilding the temple. These people are deadly serious. They now have seats in cabinet and are going ahead with it. And they've already brought 3 red heifers over to Israel, preparing them for sacrifice at the point at which this temple starts to be rebuilt. And recall, this is not something that is just a sort of little far, outlier in the case. The whole of the Israeli cabinet met not so long ago, I think about 2 months maybe or so ago, in the tunnels under Al-Aqsa and said, this is ours. We claim it. This territory is ours. And they were sitting precisely underneath the 3rd holiest site in Islam. 2 years ago, when the settlers stormed Al-Aqsa and Hamas started firing rockets into Tel Aviv, I don't know if you recall, it was about 2 years ago this happened. And the Hamas called it, and this was so important, called it, this is the Intifada of Al-Aqsa. We are there to save Al-Aqsa. Not Hamas, not the Palestinian cause, not nationalism, but this is about Al-Aqsa. And that we will protect Al-Aqsa. And what happened was unparalleled. The West Bank rose up, and for the first time, what we call the 79 Palestinians, the Palestinians that are in Israel, but who are there as the citizens of Israel. They rose up too, and you may remember it. It was a very violent place. Well, what happened just a few days ago? I mean, on Saturday we had this, right? But on Thursday, 800 radical settlers, with the support of the security forces, stormed and invaded Al-Aqsa again. It's not even mentioned, I think, very much in much of the press. But this is a really important trigger. Why? So you asked me, the first question was intelligence failure. Listen, I could see this coming. Others can see this was building. We're building because, of course, what we're talking about is the Palestinians facing another al-Nakba.
With such an overwhelming amount of warning signs of possible hostilities, it is difficult to imagine that the Israeli forces were caught completely off guard. These doubts form the basis of all the theories regarding the possibility of this being an orchestrated event. As usual, the interpretations of events are different depending on who you ask, but there are several crucial pieces of information that are often brought up, and several key questions that everyone has. These include the unstable political situation in Israel itself prior to the attack, the corruption charges brought against the Prime Minister Netanyahu, and why did the Israeli military take so long to respond?
I've been to Israel many times. The whole country's a fortress. When I first heard this story, I still had the same gut instinct that I did initially. I find this very hard to believe. I've been to that Gaza border. You cannot go 10 feet without running into a 19-year-old with an AR-15 or an automatic machine gun that is an IDF soldier. Right? The whole country is surveilled. And so let me just kind of go through this. We don't talk about Israeli politics very often, and most Americans don't know this. The last 9 months, Israel was on the brink of civil war. It's not an exaggeration. This judicial stuff, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets because Bibi Netanyahu is basically redefining the Israeli constitution. That's not an exaggeration, right? He said the judicial branch has too much power. There were protests planned this week against Netanyahu, where they anticipated tens of thousands of people to take to the streets. That's all gone, Patrick. Netanyahu now has an emergency government and a mandate to lead. I'm not willing to go so far that saying that Netanyahu knew or there was intelligence here, but I think some questions need to be asked. Was there a stand down order? Was there a stand down order? 6 hours? I don't believe it. Israel's the size of New Jersey. When I took a helicopter ride from Jerusalem to the Gaza border, it's 45 minutes. Wow. 6 hours. They're live streaming the killing of Jews. Did somebody in the government say stand down? That is a legitimate, non-conspiracy question. The whole country is the IDF. The whole country is. Yeah. And you're trying to tell me that they're going to concerts and kibbutzes and schools?
Netanyahu intentionally let Hamas kill Israelis. Both the IDF and the Israeli Air Force both stood down for 7 hours. You won't believe what a Jewish charity leader told me today.
Israel has the most sophisticated intelligence in the world. There was no way the government didn't know that was going to happen. We're friendly with several good people in Israel. One is Rabbi Hanania Weissman. He knows a lot of people in Israel. He knows confidential sources that he shared with us their information about the stand-down order. And he sent out a missive that, indeed, the IDF was given stand-down orders, both the Army and the Air Force, 7 hours to stand down while those attacks took place. And this allowed the terrorists to come in and begin slaughtering and torturing the citizens.
Obviously, these are all speculations and unverified statements from sources who claim to have knowledge of the situation, but that does not mean that they should not be heard or considered. What should be abundantly clear from this is that many of those who subscribe to the orchestrated event theory see Prime Minister Netanyahu as the main suspect. From their perspective, it was he who arranged for an obvious provocation of the Hamas movement, made sure that there will be a large social gathering with people from all over the world in a highly dangerous location to gain more publicity, and then ordered the army to stand down at the time of the invasion. This way he would be able to kill 3 birds with 1 stone: avoid going to jail, unite his country against a common enemy during a time of a severe political crisis, which threatened to spill into a civil war, and gain financial and military aid from the US government, as well as the international support required to finally resolve the Gaza problem. All well and good. However, there are many people who pointed out that Prime Minister Netanyahu is actually facing severe criticism from the Israeli public. Because the attack happened on his watch, they hold him accountable for the tragedy. It is expected that he will face severe repercussions once the crisis is over. And that doesn't even take into account that an attack on Gaza runs the risk of dragging Israel into a long drawn-out war with several neighboring countries. In summary, this theory hinges on the assumption that Prime Minister Netanyahu is someone who is incapable of seeing the obvious flaws in such a plan to ensure his personal security and prevent a civil war. Needless to say, this point of view is mostly propagated by his political opponents and arch critics. That concludes the list of theories which are predominant in the countries of the Western Bloc. None of them seem to have much traction in the Eastern countries, however. The predominant Oriental theory seems to be that it was a 4D chess move by the USA and their allies. Proponents of this theory believe that with the expansion of the economic ties and increasing diplomatic successes of China in the region, the West began to feel that their influence over the Middle East is slipping right into the hands of their adversaries. In addition to that, the country which, as some would argue, exists solely thanks to the funds from the USA, and therefore could be considered their most loyal ally, started to become entangled in a dangerous internal strife. This internal strife threatened to remove from power the Ashkenazi Jews, with whom the American establishment had a long-standing productive partnership, and replace them with the Mizrahi Jews, who may not have been as accommodating. Therefore, rather than lose the region, a decision was made to set it on fire in order to reign over the ashes. If this theory is to be believed, everything was orchestrated by the CIA and elements of the Mossad who opposed the Netanyahu government. Considering that both agencies had a hand in the creation of Hamas, it would not be a surprise that they would still have channels of communication open with them. The goals of the USA, according to this theory, is to set off a chain reaction of escalation in the region and have an excuse for their military to be deployed and start a long-desired war with Iran in order to destroy any possibility of Chinese integration into the economy of the region. The blame for the conflict, as well as the war crimes, could then be dumped onto the government of Netanyahu, who has already lost favor with the USA establishment, and naturally will be disposed of in the aftermath. In fairness, it should be noted that this theory is mostly proposed by arch critics of the USA, who hold significant bias towards that country. And just like with the Netanyahu hypothesis, not much is offered in terms of proof. The Russian blogger Dmitry Puchkov brought up the release of American hostages as an indicator that the US is in active communication with Hamas, but that is not an indicator of culpability. Mostly, attention is being drawn to the fact that a large military buildup is currently happening in the Middle East, and that looks more like an invasion force rather than a deterrent. The rhetoric from the US politicians doesn't help, and there was also that statement by Joe Biden recently.
My warning to the Ayatollah was that if they continue to move against those troops, we will respond, and he should be prepared. It has nothing to do with Israel.
These are all, of course, ominous signs, but as of now, only time will be able to tell us whether or not we will see a large military conflict in the Middle East. Let us hope for the best. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like the video, share it with your friends, consider subscribing. See you next time.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
Выборы последние были. В 2024 году выборов у вас не будет. Не будет страны под названием Украина. Вы не учитываете ситуацию на Ближнем Востоке. Там развернутся такие события, что все забудут вообще, что такое Украина. Дело идет о Третьей мировой войне. И Иран это не Вьетнам, и не Северная Корея, и не Косово. Здесь будут самые страшные события. Мы будем вынуждены пропустить беженцев туда, к вам. К вам Европа пропустит, турки по нашей просьбе пропустят. Вот все у вас там соберутся, и вашей стране конец. Мы вынуждены это сделать, что вы игнорируете международное право, забыли, что такое Россия, и, так сказать, нарушаете. Все, что можно, вы уже нарушили. Так сказать, вы просто издеваетесь. Вот смотрите, вы здесь находитесь сколько уже? 5 лет. А наши политологи там находятся, журналисты, спортсмены и артисты, депутаты. Вы никого не пускаете. Украинскими санкциями. Вы все запретили. Вы русских заставляете отпечатки пальцев на границе делать. Это фашистская Германия не додумалась, так сказать. Вы закрыли русский язык, радио, телевидение, газеты. Все прекратили. Ну давайте вообще границу закроем.
Already, the liberal press, if you read the liberal English-speaking press in Israel, they say it's all the fault of Netanyahu and his right wing, which distracted us and left us sort of at odds because we were all doing our protests and what have you, and we didn't see what was going to come. And then on the other side, the Mizrahi elements, I call them Mizrahi, but I mean, because it's a coalition, it's difficult. The coalition says, yeah, but who was actually, who was the chief of defense staff? Who are all these people? They're not Mizrahi, they're Ashkenazi.